In this lesson, we're going to focus on deployment because deployment is one of the challenges that any programmer is going to face when doing web apps. So let me start with a little bit of background. Many of you may be using an IDE, an integrated development environment, such as Eclipse or NetBeans or IntelliJ. There are many fine ones out there in the Java world. And those tools are very, very helpful because they automate tedious tasks such as deploying web apps. If you set things up right, you can do a click of the button and boom, the web app is deployed to Tomcat or to Jetty or to some other web server. In a learning environment, of course, we'd like to focus on some of the details that an IDE keeps from us, because we're trying to learn how things are actually working, and eventually, in debugging mode, this knowledge should prove useful. The IDEs in question, under the hood, typically use build scripts of some sort. So these are scripts written in a specialized language normally. And in the Java world, it's fair to say that Maven and Ant are the two dominant build languages. I think it's fair to say that Maven is higher level and more powerful, and that Ant is simpler. So my suggestion is this: if you're already familiar with Maven, stick with it. There are plenty of Maven build scripts to do what I'm going to be doing in a simple Ant script. And if you're not familiar with build scripts, then I'd recommend using the Ant script that I'm going to provide because it's straightforward and it takes very, very little setup. We'll look at the Ant script in the next lesson. Now let me get to the challenge. On this line, in the working file, which is called deployment1.txt, and of course we're looking at it in my Emacs editor, you see a command I've issued from the command line prompt. I'm assuming that's the %, jar tvf temp.war. So jar is a utility that ships with the JDK. It's in the same directory, the bin directory of the Java install. The T is for table of contents. The V is for verbose, and the F is for file, and the file is temp.war, which is the war file that holds the introductory web app. So I've excised some timestamps. We don't really care about those, and here's what remains in the output. There's the metainf subdirectory. We don't care much about that or its contents. The webinf subdirectory, by contrast, is very important. It contains web.xml, the deployment file. In general, XML files are going to go into webinf. And then at the top level, the two main pieces of the first web app, convert.jsp, the JSP script, and input.html. These are both text files. You could put those in the top level directory or in a subdirectory. Now let me describe the constraints. In other words, basically the rules. So I have an imaginary web file I'm calling acme.war. It's going to be deployed, and here are basically the contents. At the top level, I've got two text files, index.html, the traditional welcome page, and by.jsp, which is a JSP script. We could put these in a subdirectory if we like, but putting them at the top level is also perfectly fine. Then we've got two subdirectories of interest, webinf, which we've seen before, and lib for library. So sometimes I'll call it lib, sometimes lib. I'm not consistent. The deployment files, the XML files, go into and must go into webinf for web apps. And library files, which are jar files, go into the lib subdirectory. I have one example here, JSTL, Java Standard Template Library. We'll be seeing this in a forthcoming example. Underneath webinf, there is a classes subdirectory, and here's the short version. Any .class file, so any compiled Java file, has to go either in classes or below. So to illustrate, I've got a product list source file I'm showing down here. Its package is acme.org. So what this means is Acme has to be a subdirectory of classes, org has to be a subdirectory of Acme, and the compiled product list class has to go there. By the way, the other sort of thing you're going to see underneath this classes subdirectory are compiled servlet files, and we'll get to those a bit later. Let me summarize. The whole point of a build script, including the one that we're going to be looking at, is to automate the construction of a WAR file, and the main task is to put the goodies in the right places. So the XML files have to go someplace, the jar files have to go someplace else, the class files have to go someplace else, and so forth. So we're going to automate this. It might be useful, if you have time, to take something like temp.war and unpack it. You can do that by jar xvf, that'll unpack it, and then to put it back together manually. It's tedious, but it could be useful to do it for one example. If you don't have time, that's perfectly fine. What we'll do next is turn to the build script in Ant.